She stood in the mud outside the Mercantile in Larkspur Hollow, Kansas territory, and told Ezra Holt, in front of half the town, that she did not need a husband, not his help, not his name, and certainly not his cattle money. It was the autumn of 1878. The wind carried the smell of dust and branded hide, and her voice did not shake once. Ezra only tipped his hat and rode away without a single word. 3 weeks later, when the worst blizzard Kansas territory had seen in a decade tore the prairie sky wide open, Margaret Sinclair stood alone at his door in the freezing dark, soaked clean through and shivering hard, with nowhere left on God's earth to go, and she knocked anyway. Larkspur Hollow was not a large town. It sat on the western edge of Kansas territory, where the tall grass prairie began to surrender to shorter, tougher grass, the kind that could survive a summer without rain and a winter without mercy. In the autumn of 1878, the town had one mercantile, one church with a bell that had cracked 2 winters before and never been replaced, a land office that processed homestead claims under the Act, signed by Lincoln 16 years earlier, and a saloon that closed early on Sundays out of respect for the preacher's wife, who kept count. Margaret Sinclair had come to Larkspur Hollow 3 years before, when her father, a stubborn Scotsman named Robert Sinclair, filed a homestead claim on 160 acres of land 8 miles north of town. The Homestead Act allowed any citizen, man or woman, to claim land if they worked it for 5 years and built a dwelling upon it, and Robert Sinclair had done exactly that, plowing the stubborn Kansas soil with a mule named Duke and a will that refused to bend. When a fever took him in the spring of 1877, it was Margaret who stayed. Margaret, who finished breaking the North Field. Margaret, who learned to read a barometer and a sky the way her father had taught her, and who told the land office clerk, a nervous young man named Whitcomb, that she intended to prove up the claim herself, under the provisions that allowed a widow or an unmarried woman of age to hold title in her own name. She was 26 years old, unmarried, and she did not apologize for either fact. The town had opinions about this, as towns do. The women at the church social spoke of her in careful, pitying tones, the kind reserved for someone thought to be either very brave or very foolish, and never quite decided which. The men spoke of her land, of its water rights along Cedar Creek, of how 160 acres with a year-round creek was wasted on a woman who would surely lose it to the bank or to bad luck within a season or two. Margaret heard both kinds of talk and answered neither, because answering gave people the satisfaction of thinking they mattered enough to provoke a response. Ezra Holt ran cattle on the range that bordered her land to the east, nearly 4,000 acres he had built up over a decade of buying out failed claims and surviving 2 droughts that broke better men than him. He was 34, broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who had spent his life roping and branding rather than sitting behind a desk, and he had buried a wife 6 years earlier, a woman named Sarah, who had died of the same fever that would later take Margaret's father, though the two of them had never known each other in life. Ezra did not speak of Sarah. He kept her sewing box on the shelf above the hearth, and he did not speak of her, and the town had learned long ago not to ask. The two of them had crossed paths before, the way neighbors on the open range inevitably do, over a stray heifer that wandered onto Sinclair land, over a fence-line dispute that never became more than a terse exchange near the creek, over the ordinary friction of 2 stubborn people trying to hold onto ground that the prairie seemed determined to take back. But it was the incident outside the Mercantile that the town would remember, the one that got told and retold at the saloon and at the church social alike, though the versions differed depending on who was doing the telling. What was true, what everyone agreed upon, was this. Ezra Holt had ridden into town on a Tuesday with the intention of speaking to Margaret Sinclair about a matter that had been weighing on him for the better part of a month. Her father's debt to the bank in Ellsworth had come due, a debt Ezra knew about only because the banker, a heavy-set man named Purcell, who fancied himself important, had mentioned it while settling accounts for a cattle shipment. Ezra had ridden past the bank with the sum of that debt in his saddlebag, a sum drawn from his own account, intending to offer it to Margaret as a loan, quiet and without conditions, so that Purcell would have no excuse to move against her claim. He had not thought through how the offer would sound. He found her outside the mercantile, loading flour and coffee into a wagon, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, and dust on her boots from the walk into town. He dismounted, removed his hat, and in the plain, unadorned way that was the whole of his manner, told her that he knew about the debt, that he had the money, and that she should take it before Purcell found a reason to foreclose. Margaret Sinclair set down the sack of flour she was carrying with a care that suggested she wanted very much to throw it instead, and she looked at Ezra Holt for a long moment before she spoke. She told him she did not need his money. She told him, loud enough that Mrs. Abernathy at the mercantile counter stopped counting change to listen, that she did not need a husband, did not need his help, did not need his name, and did not intend to be the subject of charity from a rancher who had never once asked her opinion on anything before deciding he knew what was best for her. It was not, strictly, an accusation of a marriage proposal. Ezra had not proposed marriage, but the offer of money from a widower to an unmarried woman, delivered in the middle of a public street, carried an implication the whole town understood, even if Ezra himself had not intended it. And Margaret understood it better than anyone, because she had spent 3 years fighting the assumption that a woman alone on a homestead was simply a problem waiting for a man to solve. Ezra did not argue. This was, in its way, the most Ezra Holt thing about the entire encounter. He did not explain himself, did not defend his intentions, did not point out that he had meant it only as a loan between neighbors and nothing more. He simply looked at her for a moment, with an expression that a more careful observer might have read as something closer to respect than offense, put his hat back on, and rode east out of town without another word. The town talked about it for a week. Mrs. Abernathy told the version where Margaret had thrown the flour sack, which was not true, but which improved considerably in the retelling. The men at the saloon agreed that Ezra Holt had made a fool's offer and gotten exactly the answer he deserved for thinking a woman like Margaret Sinclair needed rescuing. The preacher, in a sermon that everyone understood to be about pride, though he never named names, spoke of the sin of refusing help freely given, and half the congregation looked at Margaret, and half looked away out of consideration for her feelings, which amounted to the same thing. Margaret went home to Cedar Creek and did not think of Ezra Holt for exactly as long as it took her to finish the fall harvest, which was not very long at all, because there was a particular satisfaction in remembering the look on his face when she had told him plainly what she thought, and she found herself returning to that satisfaction more often than she cared to admit. The debt to the bank remained unpaid. Purcell sent a letter in early November, reminding her of the terms, cordial in language and threatening in substance, the kind of letter bankers had perfected in the years since the Panic of '73 had taught them exactly how much pressure a struggling homesteader could bear before breaking. Margaret read the letter twice, folded it, and put it in the tin box where she kept her father's papers, and told herself she would find a way, because she had found a way through worse. She did not know, not yet, that the way would come to her in the form of the worst blizzard the territory had seen since the winter of '69. A storm that the old-timers would speak of for the rest of their lives. A storm that would arrive with almost no warning on the second week of December and bury the prairie under snow so deep that cattle froze standing where they grazed, and that would strip away, in the space of one endless night, every careful wall she had built around herself. The signs had been there if anyone had known to read them. The old cattleman spoke of how the antelope had moved south early that year, how the smoke from chimneys hung low and flat instead of rising, how the sunset on the second Tuesday of December had burned an unnatural coppery red across the whole western sky. Ezra Holt, who had survived the drought of 74 and the grasshopper plague of 75, and had learned, the hard way, to trust the land more than the almanac, brought in as many cattle as he could that afternoon, and told his one remaining hand, a young man named Cooper, to bed down in the bunkhouse rather than ride back to his own claim that night. Margaret Sinclair, 8 miles north on Cedar Creek, was less fortunate in her preparations, not from carelessness, but from circumstance. She had ridden into town that morning to collect mail and had lingered longer than planned, drawn into a conversation with Whitcomb at the land office about a discrepancy in her father's original survey that could, if unresolved, complicate her claim to prove up in the spring. By the time she left Larkspur Hollow, the sky had already begun its strange, coppery burning, and by the time she was 3 miles from home, the wind had shifted, hard and sudden, out of the northwest, carrying with it a wall of white that swallowed the horizon whole. She had crossed open prairie before in weather that turned ugly. Every homesteader had. But this was not weather turning ugly. This was something else entirely. A storm that dropped the temperature 40 degrees in under an hour, that turned snow into something less like falling water and more like flying gravel, stinging any exposed skin raw within minutes. Margaret's horse, a sturdy bay mare named Junebug, fought the wind with the stubborn instinct of an animal that knew shelter existed somewhere and could not find it. And Margaret, half blind in the whiteout, lost the road entirely somewhere past the Second Creek crossing. She would think, later, that it was not skill that saved her, but the simple dumb luck of Junebug's instinct, carrying them both roughly eastward instead of in a circle, which was the more common and more fatal outcome of a rider caught blind in a blizzard on open range. She would think later that some part of her, some part she was not proud of and would not have admitted to anyone, had been aiming for the Holt ranch house without fully deciding to, because it was the nearest shelter she knew of with any certainty, closer than her own homestead by nearly 2 miles, given the ground she had already covered. By the time the shape of a barn and a house emerged out of the white, Margaret Sinclair had lost feeling in her hands, could no longer tell whether her face was burning or freezing, and had begun to understand, in the calm and terrible way that hypothermia teaches a person to understand things, that she did not have much longer before the choice of shelter would no longer be hers to make. She got down from Junebug at what she prayed was Ezra Holt's door, though she could see almost nothing beyond a foot in front of her face, and she pounded on wood with a fist she could not feel, and she called out a name she had sworn 3 weeks earlier she would never need to call again, and she waited in the roaring dark for an answer that felt, for 3 long seconds, like it might never come. The door opened so suddenly that Margaret nearly fell forward into the dark of the front room, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, because there was nothing to say that the wind was not already saying louder. Ezra Holt stood in the doorway with a lamp in one hand, his shirt untucked and his feet bare against the floorboards, and the look on his face was not surprise so much as a kind of grim recognition, the look of a man who had spent the last 2 hours listening to a blizzard tear at his roof and wondering who among his neighbors might be caught out in it. He did not ask why she had come. He did not remark on the 3 weeks of silence between them, or on the words she had thrown at him outside the mercantile, or on the particular bitter irony of the woman who told him she needed nothing from him standing on his porch in the middle of the worst storm in a decade. He simply pulled her inside by the arm, shut the door hard against the wind, and set the lamp down before he said the only thing that seemed to matter in that moment, which was her name. Once. Low. The way a man says a word he has been carrying around without permission to speak it. Margaret could not answer him. Her jaw had locked from the cold, and when she tried to speak, Nothing came but a shudder that ran the length of her whole body. And it was Ezra who moved first, guiding her toward the hearth, where a fire still burned low, feeding it with 2 more logs before he disappeared into the back room and returned with a wool blanket that Margaret would later learn had belonged to Sarah, though neither of them spoke of that at the time. He did not touch her more than necessity required. This she would remember later, turning it over in her mind, the way a person turns over a smooth stone found on a riverbank, examining it from every angle. He helped her out of her sodden coat and gloves with the brisk, impersonal care of a man handling an injured animal. And when her boots proved too swollen with ice to remove with her frozen fingers, he knelt and worked them off himself, his eyes fixed on the task and nowhere else, and he did not say a single word about the fact that she had come to his door instead of freezing on the open prairie somewhere between his land and hers. It was Junebug he thought of next, and here Margaret found her voice, enough to tell him the mare was still outside, and Ezra was already reaching for his boots and his coat before she finished the sentence. He was gone into the storm for what felt to Margaret like an hour, but was, by the clock on the mantel, only 11 minutes. And when he returned, snow crusted thick on his eyebrows and his coat frozen nearly stiff, he reported only that the horse was safe in the barn beside his own stock, and that the wind had gotten worse, and that neither of them would be going anywhere for what he judged, based on the particular color and weight of the sky, before the light had failed entirely, to be at least 2 days, possibly 3. 2 days, possibly 3. Margaret sat by the fire wrapped in a dead woman's blanket and turned the number over in her mind, and understood, with a clarity that the cold had somehow sharpened rather than dulled, exactly what those 2 or 3 days would mean for her reputation, should anyone in Larkspur Hollow ever learn of them. A woman alone in a rancher's house, unmarried, unchaperoned, for the better part of a week. It did not matter that the storm had made the choice for her. It did not matter that there had been no other door within reach. The town that had already decided she was either brave or foolish would decide, upon hearing this, that she was neither, only ruined, and there was no homestead claim strong enough to survive that particular verdict in a place like Larkspur Hollow. Ezra seemed to read some of this on her face, because he set a pot of coffee to warm and said, in the plain way that was the whole of his manner, that Cooper was in the bunkhouse not 30 yards off, that there was a hand on the property who could speak to the propriety of things if it ever came to that, and that he would sleep in the barn himself before he let anyone say a word against her name on account of a night neither of them had chosen. It was, Margaret thought, the closest thing to tenderness she had heard from him since her father's funeral, when Ezra Holt had ridden 8 miles through spring mud to stand at the back of the small crowd, gathered at the grave, and had said nothing to her at all that day either, only removed his hat and stood until the last shovel of earth was turned, and then ridden home without a word, the way he seemed to do everything. The first night passed in near silence. Margaret slept, or something close to it, in a chair pulled near the fire, wrapped in blankets that smelled of cedar and wood smoke, and, faintly, beneath both, of someone else's lavender soap, a scent she did not ask about, and Ezra did not offer to explain. Ezra himself sat up most of the night feeding the fire and listening to the wind, and if he watched her sleep, which she suspected, based on the particular stiffness in his shoulders come morning, that he never said so, and she never asked. By the second day, the silence had begun to crack, the way ice on a pond cracks not all at once, but in small, testing fractures that spread further with each hour. It started with practical things. Margaret, restless and unwilling to sit idle while a man fed and watered stock alone in a blizzard, insisted on helping with the chores that could be managed indoors, and found herself in Ezra's kitchen, learning the particular temperament of his stove, which ran hot on one side and cold on the other, a fact he had apparently never thought to mention to anyone, because he had never had anyone in his kitchen long enough for it to matter. They ate together at a table built for a family that had never come, Ezra having married Sarah only 2 years before the fever took her, before children had been part of their story, a fact Margaret gathered slowly, through the gaps in what he did and didn't say, rather than through any direct confession. She did not press him. She had her own gaps, her own silences about her father's last winter, about the particular loneliness of 5 years working land that was supposed to belong to a family, and instead belonged, now, only to her. And Ezra did not press her either. And there was a strange comfort in two people who each understood, without needing it explained, the specific weight the other was carrying. The storm outside did not relent. If anything, the second night brought it worse. The wind finding some new register of violence that made the whole house groan on its foundations. And it was during this second night, with the fire built high and the coffee gone cold in its pot, that Margaret finally asked the question she had been circling since the mercantile. She asked him why he had offered her the money. Ezra was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all, and when he did, his voice had none of the plain flatness she had grown used to. He told her that he had watched her, these 3 years, work land that would have broken most men he knew, and do it alone, without complaint, without asking anyone for anything, and that something in that had reminded him of the particular stubbornness Sarah had carried in her own smaller way, before the fever, and that he had told himself the money was only about the debt and about being a decent neighbor, but that somewhere in the riding to town that Tuesday he had known it was not only that, and he had gone anyway because a part of him had wanted, foolishly, to be someone she could rely on, even for one small thing, even if she never once had to admit needing him. It was, Margaret would think later, the longest sentence she had ever heard Ezra Holt speak, and possibly the most honest thing anyone had said to her since her father died. She did not tell him that night everything the mercantile outburst had truly been about. She did not tell him that the words she had thrown at him in the street had less to do with him specifically and more to do with every version of the same conversation she had endured since her father's funeral. Every well-meaning suggestion that a woman alone could not truly hold 160 acres, that she needed a husband the way a fence needed a post, structural rather than chosen. She did not tell him that some small, unguarded part of her had wanted, even as she said the words, for him to argue with her, to tell her she was wrong, and that his silence afterward had stung far worse than any argument would have. She told him some of it, enough that he understood, by the low burn of the fire on the second night of the storm, why a simple offer of money had detonated something larger. And Ezra listened the way he seemed to do everything, without interruption, without the need to fill her silences with his own opinions. And when she finished, he said only that he understood now, and that he was sorry for the manner of the offer, if not the offer itself, and that he would not make that mistake again. By the third day, the wind had begun, finally, to lose some of its violence, dropping from a full roar to something more like a constant, grinding moan, and the two of them, trapped together in a house too quiet for anything but honesty, found themselves talking in a way that neither had allowed themselves to talk with another living soul in years. Margaret spoke of her father, of the particular way he used to test the wind with a wetted finger before deciding whether to plant, of the last conversation they had before the fever took him, when he had told her, in a voice already thick with sickness, that she was the better farmer between the two of them, and always had been, and that he wasn't worried about the land, only about leaving her alone with it. Ezra spoke, finally, of Sarah, of the 2 years of marriage that had felt, in memory, both impossibly short and impossibly complete, of the particular silence of the house in the months after, when he had kept her sewing box on the shelf, not out of unwillingness to move forward, but because moving it felt like admitting she had never truly been there at all. He told her he had not expected to feel anything again, had built the last 6 years around the assumption that he would not, and that the last 3 weeks, since the mercantile, had unsettled that assumption in ways he had not yet found words for. It was somewhere in the space between that confession and the fire burning down to embers that Margaret Sinclair understood, with the same terrible clarity that had told her, on the open prairie, that she did not have much longer before the storm made her choice for her, that something had shifted between them that could not simply be unshifted once the snow melted and the roads opened, and the town of Larkspur Hollow returned to watching them both. She did not know on that third night, with the wind finally dying and the first hard stars showing through breaks in the cloud, that the true test of what had grown between them in that snowbound house was not the storm at all. It was what waited for them both once the roads cleared, in the form of a letter already sitting in Purcell's desk at the bank in Ellsworth, a letter that named a buyer for her father's debt, a buyer whose name, when she finally learned it, would turn everything she thought she understood about Ezra Holt's intentions on its head. The storm broke fully on the 4th morning, the wind dying to nothing sometime before dawn, so that the silence it left behind felt almost as violent as the noise it replaced. Margaret woke in the chair by the hearth to a stillness so complete she could hear the particular creak of Ezra's boots crossing the kitchen floor. And when she stepped outside for the first time in 4 days, the world she found was one she barely recognized. The prairie transformed into a rolling white expanse, broken only by the dark humps of drifted fence posts and the black smudges where cattle had huddled against whatever windbreak they could find. Cooper rode out from the bunkhouse within the hour, and it was Cooper who brought the first real news from town, having ridden the 8 miles into Larkspur Hollow on an errand for feed, and returned with more than feed alone. The talk in town, he said, was that the roads north of the Ellsworth Bank had been impassable for most of the week, which was no surprise to anyone who had lived through the storm, but that Purcell had nonetheless managed, in the single day the telegraph lines held before the storm cut them, to send word of an interested buyer for several notes the bank held on struggling claims, Margaret Sinclair's among them. The name Cooper had heard, secondhand from the mercantile, was Josiah Hargrove, a land speculator out of Ellsworth, who had spent the better part of 2 years quietly buying up water rights along creeks and rivers throughout the county, anticipating the day the railroad spur, long rumored and twice delayed, would finally reach that stretch of Kansas territory and turn worthless range grass into some of the most valuable ground in the state. Cedar Creek ran through Margaret's claim for nearly half a mile, one of the few reliable year-round water sources for 10 miles in any direction. And Ezra, hearing the name, went very still in a way that told Margaret, even before he spoke, that this was not news to be taken lightly. Hargrove did not want a struggling homesteader's cooperation. Hargrove wanted the water, and a man who bought up defaulted notes with the specific intention of foreclosing rather than collecting had no interest in payment plans or patience. If Hargrove now held Margaret's debt, the letter Purcell had sent in November calling for payment would look, in retrospect, less like an ordinary banker's caution and more like the opening move of a much larger and more deliberate maneuver, one that had likely been in motion for months before Margaret ever knew her father's debt had become anything other than an ordinary obligation between a homesteader and a small-town bank. Margaret felt something cold settle in her chest that had nothing to do with the lingering effects of the blizzard. 5 years of proving up a claim, 5 years of breaking sod and fighting drought and grasshoppers, and now this, a stranger from Ellsworth who had never once set foot on Cedar Creek, deciding, from a desk in a town she had visited only a handful of times, that her father's land and her own 5 years of labor amounted to nothing more than an obstacle between himself and a railroad spur that might not even arrive for another 2 years, if ever. It was here, in the cold clarity of that fourth morning, that the true shape of Ezra's offer outside the mercantile finally became clear to her, and with it came a shame she had not expected to feel. He had known, or at least suspected, that something larger than an ordinary debt was moving beneath the surface of Purcell's letters, and he had ridden to town that Tuesday, not out of some misguided notion that she needed rescuing, but because he had understood, better than she had allowed herself to, exactly what kind of danger a defaulted note on water rights could represent in a county where the railroad was the only subject anyone in Ellsworth ever seemed to discuss. She said as much to him, standing in the yard, with the snow still falling from the eaves in long silver ropes, and Ezra, who had never once in 4 days asked her to apologize for the words she'd thrown at him outside the mercantile, only shook his head and said that her anger had been fair regardless of his intentions, because a woman did not owe gratitude for help she never asked for, not even when the help turned out to be necessary, and that the two things, the fairness of her anger and the truth of the danger, could both be true at the same time without canceling each other out. It was, Margaret thought, a more generous accounting of her own behavior than she had given herself in 3 weeks of turning the mercantile scene over in her mind. And it was in that moment, more than in any of the long conversations of the previous 3 nights, that she understood the particular nature of what had grown between them was not the desperate, storm-forced closeness of 2 people trapped together, but something that had been building quietly since long before the blizzard, since the funeral, since the fence-line disputes, and the stray heifer, and every small, ordinary encounter 2 stubborn neighbors accumulate over 3 years of sharing a boundary line. The roads opened enough for travel 2 days later, and Margaret rode home to Cedar Creek with Ezra and Cooper, both insisting on accompanying her, ostensibly to help dig out her own homestead from the drifts that had surely piled against her door in her absence, though Margaret suspected, and did not entirely mind suspecting, that neither man much wanted the journey to end so soon. Her small house had survived the storm intact, though a corner of the barn roof had partially collapsed under the snow load, and it was Ezra who spent the better part of 2 days repairing it himself, working in the cold with the same plain, unhurried competence he brought to everything, while Margaret cooked meals in her own kitchen for the first time in a week and found the silence of her own house, which had never bothered her before, now felt oddly larger than it once had. The confrontation with Hargrove, when it came, arrived not on the open prairie in a scene of drawn revolvers, as the saloon gossips would later embellish it into being, but in the far more ordinary setting of the Larkspur Hollow land office, where Whitcomb, the nervous young clerk, had summoned both Margaret and Ezra separately upon receiving formal notice that the note on Robert Sinclair's original claim had indeed transferred to a Josiah Hargrove of Ellsworth, along with a demand for payment in full within 30 days, or the initiation of foreclosure proceedings under the terms Purcell had drawn up the previous autumn. 30 days was not enough time to raise the sum through any ordinary means, not with the ground still frozen and no harvest to sell until autumn, and Margaret understood, reading the notice in Whitcomb's cramped little office with the frozen window rattling in its frame, that this was precisely the point. Hargrove had no intention of collecting a debt. He intended to take the land, and he had chosen the dead of winter, when a homesteader's resources were at their thinnest, and the ground offered no immediate means of raising capital, with the same cold calculation a man might use in reading a poker hand. It was Ezra who suggested, quietly and without any of the fumbling awkwardness of the mercantile offer 3 months earlier, that they approach the matter together rather than separately, not as an act of charity from a rancher to a struggling neighbor, but as what he called, deliberately and with some care in the choosing of the word, a partnership, one that acknowledged both the boundary they shared and the particular value of Cedar Creek's water to both their operations, his cattle needing reliable water as much as her fields did, a fact that had been true for 3 years and that neither of them had ever formally addressed. The proposal he made, when he finally made it, in the plain front room of his own ranch house with the fire burning low, and Cooper conveniently absent on an errand that Margaret suspected had been invented for the occasion, was not the offer of rescue that had detonated so badly outside the mercantile. It was, instead, an honest accounting of what he wanted, spoken with the same unadorned directness that was the whole of his manner, that he had come to care for her, deeply and without qualification, somewhere in the space of 3 years of ordinary neighboring and 4 days of extraordinary closeness, and that he was asking, not telling, whether she might consider a marriage that would combine their claims, defeat Hargrove's foreclosure through the simple mathematics of combined resources and combined water rights, and give them both, if she wanted it, a chance at the kind of partnership neither of them had quite dared hope for again. Margaret did not answer immediately, and to his credit, Ezra did not press her, sitting instead in the particular patient silence that she had come to recognize, over 4 days snowed in together, as perhaps the truest expression of who he was. She thought of her father, of his last words about not wanting to leave her alone with the land, and understood, turning the thought over with the same care she gave to reading a winter sky, that accepting Ezra's proposal would not be the abandonment of everything she had fought for these 5 years, but rather, potentially, the securing of it on terms she herself had helped negotiate rather than terms imposed upon her by a bank or a speculator or a town full of opinions about what a woman alone was owed or capable of. She told him finally that she would marry him, but not out of necessity, not because Hargrove's 30-day notice demanded it, and she made him understand, in terms as plain as his own proposal had been, that if the note had never existed at all, if Hargrove had never set his sights on Cedar Creek, she would still be sitting in this room considering this same question, because somewhere in the last 3 months, and perhaps somewhere in the 3 years before, that which she had simply refused to examine too closely, she had come to care for him in the same deep and unqualified way he had described caring for her. The wedding took place in late January, in the small church with the cracked bell, officiated by the same preacher who had once delivered a sermon on the sin of refusing help, a sermon that took on a rather different resonance in retrospect. The town that had spent 3 years debating whether Margaret Sinclair was brave or foolish now debated, with equal enthusiasm and considerably more warmth, whether the whole affair had been a romance born of the blizzard or one that had simply used the blizzard as its excuse to finally happen. And Margaret, standing at the front of the church in a dress sewn from fabric she and Ezra had bought together in Ellsworth on the same trip where they formally settled Hargrove's note in full, found she no longer minded what the town decided to believe. Hargrove, upon learning that the combined resources of the Holt and Sinclair claims now merged under a single note that Purcell himself had helped restructure once the immediate danger of a hostile foreclosure evaporated, could satisfy the debt in full within the required window, withdrew from the county entirely within the year, redirecting his attention to a stretch of land 40 miles east, where the railroad's actual route, when finally announced 2 years later, would prove considerably more favorable to his interests than Cedar Creek had ever been, a small and satisfying irony that Ezra liked to mention, in his own quiet way, whenever the subject of speculators arose at the mercantile. Margaret kept her father's name on the deed alongside her husband's, a legal arrangement Whitcomb had never processed before, and had to research at some length before determining it was, in fact, permissible under the territorial statutes, and she continued to work the north field herself each spring, the same field she had broken with her father's mule and her own stubborn will, now alongside a husband who never once suggested she ought to stop, understanding, better than most men of his era, that the land had always been as much hers as the marriage now made it his. The sewing box that had sat on the shelf above Ezra's hearth for 6 years found a new place eventually, not discarded, but moved, gently, into a cedar chest in the back room, making room on the shelf for a photograph taken in Ellsworth on their wedding day, the two of them standing stiff and formal in the way photographs of that era demanded, though anyone who looked closely enough at Margaret's face in that photograph could see something that no amount of formal posing could fully suppress, a kind of quiet, hard-won happiness that had traveled a long road from a muddy street outside the Mercantile to a snowbound door in the worst storm Kansas Territory had seen in a decade. And from there, finally, home. She had told him once, in front of half the town, that she did not need a husband. She had meant it, every word, and in a strange way she still meant it, because what grew between Margaret Sinclair and Ezra Holt was never born of need. It was born of a knock on a door in the worst storm the territory had ever seen, of two stubborn people who had spent 3 years circling each other without knowing it, of a love that arrived unannounced and asked nothing except to be let in out of the cold. That is the truth this story leaves behind. Sometimes the thing we swear we will never need is standing right outside our door, waiting through the storm until we finally have the courage to knock. If this story moved you, follow this channel for more true stories of love and courage from the American frontier. Like this video if Margaret and Ezra's story stayed with you. And tell us in the comments, would you have knocked on that door too?